They gave me a number before they gave me a brush, and for the first month I believed the number was the truer name. 41. It was stitched into the gray of my coat and burned into the wood of my bunk, and the guards used it the way you use a tool, without looking at it, certain it would do its one job and stay where it was set down. I answered to it. A person learns fast what answering buys her in a place like the Reach, and what silence costs. I am old now, and there are mornings my hands will not close all the way, and still, when someone behind me says a number sharply, my shoulders go down before my mind catches up. The body keeps the old sentence long after the court forgets it ever sat. I want to tell this the way it happened, in order, because the order is the only part of it I am sure I have right. The rest the years have worn smooth, the way water wears a step, but I was there for all of it. I was the one with my knees on the stone and the cold coming up through the cloth pad they let us use, and I am the only one left who can say what the morning smelled like, and what the light did, and how the great dark thing in the middle of the hall finally moved. So I will tell it the way I lived it, and you can weigh it however you like. Weighing is what this is about in the end. I learned that late. Kale Reach was a colony grown too fast on a world that had belonged to something else first. The founders had come down for the metal in the southern ranges and stayed for the soil in the river valleys, and by the time I was born, the township had spread across the old foundations the way moss spreads across a wall, taking the shape of what was under it without ever asking what that shape had been for. There were lines in the ground that no surveyor had cut. There were chambers below the granaries that no one had dug. And in the center of the oldest district, where the founders had raised their hall of governance because the ground there was already flat and already strong, there stood a thing they had not built and could not move. We called it the weighing stone. The records called it the monolith with a capital letter, the way clerks capitalize a thing they do not understand to make it sound governed. It was black, not the black of paint or pitch, but the black of deep glass, obsidian poured and cooled in some age before there were any of us to give it a name, and it stood 3 times the height of a tall man and twice that in girth, a single slab with edges so true they looked cut by light rather than tool. There were seams in it, fine as the lines in an old man's palm, running floor to crown in patterns that did not repeat and did not waste themselves on ornament. In a certain slant of the morning sun, those seams caught a grayer light than the surface around them, and you could believe for a moment that the stone was not solid at all but folded, like a thing that could open. It never opened, not for the founders, who built the hall of the long weighing around it because they could not haul it out and would not leave it in the weather. Not for the first assize, the magistrates who took the hall for their court because a black monument in a tall, pale room makes a fine backdrop for the handing down of sentences. Not for any of the magistrates after them, and there were many, generation on generation, each one certain that he, at last, would be the one the old thing had been waiting for. That was the part the assize could never let go of. The stone had a use. Anyone could feel it. It was not a statue and not a marker. It had the patient, loaded stillness of a tool set down between jobs, and every man who ever stood before it in the chain of office felt the same thing the founders had felt, the same thing I felt the first day they marched me in to scrub it, that it was waiting for a hand. The founders' own records, the ones from before my time that I later had read to me, said as much in their dry way. The monolith is responsive in principle, but has not responded. Responsive in principle. They wrote it the way you would write of a lock you had not found the key to, and they spent 2 centuries looking for the key. They looked in the wrong place, which is the whole of the story, but I am getting ahead of myself. By the time I came to the hall, it was less a court than a shrine to the court's frustration. Along the base of the stone, in the wide pale trough where the floor met the black, the magistrates had been leaving offerings for as long as anyone living could remember. Not flowers. The assize did not deal in flowers. They left the instruments of their authority, as if the stone might recognize a kindred thing and wake to greet it. There were seals of office, heavy bronze discs stamped with the Reach's cross-balance mark. There were measures, the true measures, the master weights against which every grain scale and coin scale in the colony was calibrated. a set of bronze cylinders from a feather's weight up to a slab 2 men could barely lift, each one cast with the assize's stamp and laid at the stone's foot in the belief that an old engine of judgment might respect a young one. There were petitions, sealed in wax, the requests of magistrates long dead asking the stone to confirm a verdict, to settle a succession, to break a deadlock. The wax had gone the color of old teeth. No seal had ever been broken from within. It was a heap of power, and it had bought nothing. The stone took it all and gave back its own black silence, and the magistrates, unable to bear that silence, dressed it up as patience and called the waiting a virtue. They told themselves the stone was reserving itself for a worthy hand, and that the worthiest hand in any age was, by the plain logic of office, the first magistrate's. So each new first magistrate came on the day of his investiture, and laid his palm flat against the cold black and waited, before the whole assembled court, for the thing to know him. And it was not only the magistrates who had tried. The records I later had read to me told of stranger efforts, across the centuries, by people who could not abide that a thing should hold a use and refuse to give it up. There had been scholars who lived their whole lives at the stone's foot copying out the seams, certain the figure in the black was a script that could be read and, once read, commanded. They filled rooms with their copies and died, and the rooms were lost, and the seams meant nothing to anyone after them. There had been a first magistrate early on, who in his frustration had a scaffold raised against the stone and laid his palm to the crown of it, as high as a man could climb, reasoning that the worthy place to be known was the head and not the foot. The stone gave him the same nothing from above that it gave everyone below, and the scaffold came down, and the reaching from above was quietly never tried again. There had been a season, the record said, when the assize brought the condemned to the stone before sentencing and made them lay a hand on it, in the belief that a guilty hand would draw some sign from the old engine of judgment, a flaring, a darkening, anything. No hand ever drew a sign, guilty or otherwise, and after enough silence the practice was abandoned as superstition, which is what a true thing always looks like to people asking it the wrong question. They had asked the stone, for 300 years, to know the powerful and to mark the guilty, and it had answered every one of them with the same patient black, because it was not built to do either, and no one in all that time had thought to ask what it was built to do. It never knew them. I watched it not know 3 of them in my years there. I will come to that. My own road to the hall was short and ran downhill the whole way. Before I was 41 I was Cephamon, and before I was a convict I was a measure keeper, which in Kale Reach was a small and friendless office. A measure keeper's work is to go from granary to granary and market to market with a satchel of the true weights and check the scales against them, so that when a poor family buys a measure of grain they get a measure of grain, and not 9/10 of one with the merchant's thumb on the truth. It is dull work and it makes you no allies, because everyone you check would rather not be checked, and the only people who love you for it are the ones too poor to thank you with anything but a nod. I did it for 11 years. I was good at it. I had a steady hand and a colder eye than a young woman is supposed to have, and I did not take the small gifts that were always being slid across counters toward me, not because I was holy, but because once you take the first one your hand is no longer your own, and a measure keeper with a borrowed hand is worse than no measure keeper at all. In my 11th year, I checked the granaries of the river district, where the relief grain was kept. The stores the assize doled out to the poor in the lean season after the floods. The scales there were short, not by accident and not by a thumb. They were short by design, the beams shaved and the master weights swapped for lighter casts, so that every measure handed to a hungry family was a measure on paper and 4/5 of one in the sack. The difference, multiplied across a district across a season, was a great deal of grain, and grain in a lean year is money, and the money had a direction. I followed it the only way a measure keeper can, with arithmetic, and the arithmetic pointed at the storehouse of Magistrate Holt Varon, who held the river district and 3 seats on the assize, and a great deal more grain than his ledgers admitted. I should have been afraid, and I was, but fear has never once stopped my hand from writing down a true number. That is a flaw in me more than a virtue. A wiser woman feels the fear and lets it move her arm. I felt it and wrote the number anyway, and I filed the report through the proper channel, up to the Office of Measures, which answered to the Assize, which answered to Holt Varon among others. You can see the shape of it. The report went up and the verdict came down, and the verdict was that the master weights I carried had been tampered with, that the shortfall was mine, that a measure keeper of 11 years had quietly been robbing the poor of the river district one sack at a time, and had built a clumsy fiction to cover it when a magistrate's audit drew near. They had documents. They had a witness, a granary clerk who wept on the stand and would not look at me and who got a better post in the spring. They had my own satchel of weights, which had indeed been tampered with in the 3 days it sat in evidence. And they had the stone, in whose hall they tried me, the great black silence at the magistrate's back lending its borrowed weight to everything said in front of it. The first magistrate read the sentence with his hand resting on a corner of the stone, a habit of the office, a way of saying the law itself agrees. The law itself, that day, was a slab of dead glass that had never once agreed with anyone, but it looked like agreement, and looking like a thing is enough in a court to hang a true number on a true woman. 11 years for theft of relief stores, the term to be served in labor at the disposition of the Assize. The disposition of the Assize was that I should clean the hall in which I had been condemned. I have wondered since whether Varon chose that on purpose, to set the woman who had counted his grain on her knees beneath the monument every day for 11 years, where he could see her when court was in session, and be reminded that the truth, in Kale Reach, did exactly what he told it to. I think he did. He was a man who liked his lessons close to hand. So I came to the stone. The work itself I can describe in a sentence, because it never varied. Before the court convened, I scrubbed the floor of the hall, the long pale flags from the great doors to the dais, and I cleaned the trough at the stone's base where the dust gathered around the offerings, and I wiped the lower reach of the stone itself, as high as a kneeling woman can reach, which the senior cleaners would not touch out of a superstition they would not name. After court I did it again, because a day of boots and robes and the small filth of judgment leaves its marks. Twice a day, every day, for what I expected to be 11 years, I knelt at the foot of the thing the whole colony venerated and could not wake, and I made it clean for men who deserved it less than the floor did. I will not pretend I felt anything holy at first. I felt the cold through the pad. I felt the ache that lives in the knees of anyone who kneels for a living. I felt the eyes of the guards and the boredom of the court, and the particular shame of being made into furniture in the room where you were ruined. The stone was just the largest object in a room full of objects I had to keep clean. If anything, I resented it, the way you resent a thing that was present at your worst hour and did nothing. It had stood at Varon's back while he lied me into gray cloth, and it had not so much as warmed. That changed slowly, the way most true changes come. You cannot kneel before a thing twice a day for years and not begin to know it, the way a sailor knows a coast he has never landed on. I came to know the stone's surface better than I knew my own face, which I rarely saw. I learned where the seams ran close enough to lay a thumbnail in, and where they ran so fine you could only find them by the cold, because the seams were always a breath colder than the surface around them, even in the high heat of the dry months when the hall baked under its tall windows. I learned that the black was not one black but many, that in the white light of midday it threw back a hard slate sheen, and in the gold of late afternoon it drank the light and gave back almost nothing, a black so deep it looked like a hole cut in the room. I learned its sounds, which most people would tell you a solid stone does not have. When the great doors opened and the wind came down the hall, the stone gave a sound under the wind, not a ring and not a hum but a low settling, the way a deep bell sounds an hour after it has been struck, when only the memory of the tone is left in the metal. I felt it more than heard it. I felt it in the flags through my knees. And I learned, without ever deciding to, that the stone was attentive. I cannot put it more plainly than that, and I know how it sounds. It did not watch me. It had nothing to watch with. But there is a difference between being alone in a room and being alone in a room with a sleeping animal, and the hall, empty in the gray hour before the court came in, had the second feeling and not the first. The stone was not dead. The magistrates were wrong about a great many things, but they were right about that. It was a tool set down between jobs, and it was waiting, and on the long mornings when there was no one but the two of us I sometimes spoke to it. Lo, the way you speak to a horse you are not sure of, and the silence afterward had a quality that the silence before had not. As if it had heard, and was deciding whether the thing it heard was worth the trouble of an answer. I told it true things. That was the only kind of thing I had left to give anyone, and there was no one else to give them to. I told it I had not robbed the poor of the river district. I told it the scales had been short before I ever touched them, and by whose design, and where the grain had gone. I told it the granary clerk's name and how he could not look at me, and I told it that I did not hate him, which surprised me to find was true, because a frightened man who chooses his own warmth over another's truth is the commonest thing in the world and the easiest to forgive once you have stopped expecting better. I told it that I would have written the number again, even knowing where it led, and that this was either the best or the most foolish thing about me, and I had given up trying to decide which. I told it these things in the gray mornings with my brush going in slow circles on the cold black, and the stone took them the way it took the offerings in silence, and gave back nothing I could name. The years went by like that. 3 first magistrates came and laid their palms on the stone on their investiture days before the full assembled court, and stood there in the pale light waiting to be known, and were not known, and turned it into ceremony, a humble waiting, a virtue. The first of the 3 I watched was an old man named Crail who wept a little when nothing happened, and I think believed, in his way, that the unworthiness was his own and bore it like a penance. I almost liked him. The second was a hard, quick man named Osric who did not wait long and pretended he had not expected anything, and was angry the rest of his term in a way that fell, as such anger falls, on the people with the least standing to absorb it. The third was Varon. Holt Varon rose to first magistrate in the 9th year of my sentence. He was older by then and heavier and slower, but the eyes had not changed, and when he came down the hall on his investiture day in the white robe with the cross-balance worked in gold across the shoulders, he found me at my place at the stone's foot, where the assize had kept me for 9 years so that he could find me there, and he stopped, and he smiled, and he said, "Still counting, 41. I did not answer. You learn what answering buys. He laid his palm on the stone before the whole court with the confidence of a man who has spent his life being right by decree, and he waited to be known. The hall was full. The light came down through the tall windows in long bars, and the dust hung in them. And the black stood at his back drinking the gold and giving nothing, and Holt Varon of the river district, first magistrate of Kale Reach, the man who had shorted the relief grain and hung it on me, stood with his hand on the oldest engine of judgment any of us knew of and was not known by it. The silence went on too long, the way it always did, and then he took his hand back and turned it into ceremony, a humble waiting, a virtue, and the court murmured its approval, and he sat in the high seat with the dead black thing at his back and ran the colony from in front of it for 2 more years. I tell you all of this so that you will understand the morning, and why I did the small thing I did, and why it was not small at all. It was the early dry season of my 11th year. My sentence was months from its end, and I had stopped letting myself think about the end, because hope in gray cloth is a knife you keep turning on yourself. I had been sick that spring, a long low fever that the work camp medic treated with rest she could not give me and food I did not get, and I had come out of it thin in a way I had never been thin in the hands, so that the brush felt heavy and the cold went straight to the bone of me. The lean season had been hard on everyone below the magistrate class, and the relief grain that year was short again, the way it always was when a Varon held the river district, and the work camp rations were short because the camp drew from relief stores. And I was, by the plain arithmetic I had spent my life keeping, slowly starving in the room I kept clean for the man who had arranged it. I knew exactly how short I was. That is the curse of a measure keeper. Other starving people at least have the mercy of not knowing the figures. I knew mine. I knew the weight I had lost and the weight a body can lose before it stops finding its way back. And I knew I was near the second number, near enough that I had begun to do the cold private arithmetic everyone in that place eventually does. The arithmetic of how much longer, and whether the end of the sentence or the end of me would come first. I was at the trough that morning before court, cleaning the dust from around the offerings. I had done it 10,000 times. The master weights of the old assize lay where they always lay, the bronze cylinders in their row, dulled with the centuries, the smallest no bigger than a thumb, the largest the slab 2 men could barely lift. They were the true weights, the ancient calibration set, worth nothing to the dead magistrates who had laid them there, and worth, to a starving woman who had once made her living by them, more than I can easily say. Bronze is bronze. The work camp commissary did not care whose stamp was on a lump of metal. A single one of the small weights, the second smallest, the one cast for a half measure, was bronze enough to buy more bread than I had seen in a month. It had lain at the stone's foot, untouched, useless, for longer than the colony had a name. No one counted them. No magistrate had looked at the offerings in living memory. They were holy by neglect, the way a thing becomes holy when everyone has agreed to stop seeing it. I had thought about it before. I will not lie to you and say the thought came to me fresh and pure that morning and was refused on the instant. I had thought about that row of bronze for 2 starving months, the way you think about water when you are thirsty, helplessly, the thought arriving on its own and staying. No one would know. No one had counted them in 300 years. I could take the half-measure weight, and the camp would never ask where the bread came from, and I would not die in the last months of an 11-year sentence for a crime I did not commit, in the hall where they had pinned it on me, 3 strides from the seat where Holt Varron sat, and called the silence of a dead stone the agreement of the law. I had my brush in one hand and my other hand was on the floor of the trough for balance, and the half-measure weight was under my palm. I do not remember reaching for it. I remember it was in my hand, the cold bronze of it, lighter than its size because of the years wear, the old stamp worn nearly smooth under my thumb. I remember the weight of it, which I knew to the grain, because I had carried its living twin in my satchel for 11 years before they took the satchel and my name. And I remember the room very clearly, the long bars of early light, the dust, the great doors still shut, the guards not yet at their posts, the stone at my shoulder drinking the gray of the morning and giving nothing. I was alone with it, the way I had been alone with it 10,000 mornings. There was no one to see. There was no number to write, no report to file, no granary clerk to weep on the stand. There was only my hand and the bronze in it and the long arithmetic of how much longer. I want to tell you that I thought about the poor of the river district, that I weighed the bread for one starving woman against some larger principle and chose the principle. That would be a finer story and it would be a lie. I did not think about the river district. I was too hungry to think about anyone. What I thought, kneeling there with the half-measure weight in my fist, was a smaller and harder thing, and it was this, that the weight in my hand was not mine. That was the whole of it. It was not a question of who would know. It was not a question of the poor, or the principal, or the assize, or even of bread. It was that the bronze cylinder pressed into my palm had a true owner, which was the dead who had laid it there and the keeping that had held it since, and I was not that owner, and no degree of hunger changes the simple fact of whose a thing is. I had spent 11 years and my whole life before them holding the line between what is owed and what is taken, and I was not, even starving, even in the last months, even unwatched in the one room in the world where I had most reason to take, going to be the one to move that line by a single grain. Not because I was holy, because the line was true, and a true thing does not stop being true because no one is looking. I put it back. I set the half-measure weight down in its place in the row, exactly where it had lain, and I straightened the line of it with the edge of my thumb the way I straighten everything, out of 11 years of habit and a lifetime before that, so that the row of true weights at the stone's foot was once again a true row, even and ordered, each in its place. And I picked up my brush and I went back to the dust, and that I thought was the end of it. A small private fight, fought and won and lost by no one in an empty hall over a lump of bronze. The kind of thing that happens inside a person 100 times and is never seen and changes nothing. The stone disagreed. It began as cold. I had my hand flat in the trough, having just set the weight down, and the cold of the black went up through my palm the way it always did, the seam cold, a breath colder than the surface. Only it did not stop at a breath. It went on getting colder, and then it stopped being cold and became something else, a feeling I had no word for then and have only a poor one for now, a feeling like the moment before a struck bell sounds, when the metal has been hit and the air has not yet caught up, when the whole room is leaning toward a noise that has not arrived. I took my hand back. The black under where my palm had been was no longer black. There was a light in the seam there, the finest line of it, pale, not gold and not white, but the pale of the sky at the very edge of dawn before there is any color in it, the pale of clean bone, and it was running. It ran up the seam from the trough the way water runs up a wick, faster than water, the pale line climbing the fine crack in the black toward the crown of the stone, and where it went the cold went with it, and where the cold went the low settling sound rose, the deep bell memory tone, only now it was not a memory, it was building, the whole great slab beginning to ring under itself the way the floor rings under a coming weight. I was on my knees in front of it with my thin hands held up in front of me, useless, and I did the only thing a body does, which is nothing, which is freeze and watch. The light reached the crown and did not stop. It spread. From the single climbing line, it broke sideways into the network of seams I had spent 11 years learning by the cold of my thumb, the patterns that did not repeat and did not waste themselves, and I understood, watching the pale light find them all and fill them, that they were not flaws and not ornament, that they had never been either, that the whole black face of the stone was a single vast figure too large and too fine to read from the foot of it, a writing or a circuitry or a thing that was both. And that for as long as any of us had stood before it, it had simply been unlit. The founders had called it responsive in principle. They had not known how right they were and how wrong, because they had spent 2 centuries looking for the key in the heaviest hands in the colony, and the key had never been a hand at all. It had been a thing a hand does. The great doors opened. The morning guard came in with the first of the court clerks, and I heard a man's voice begin the ordinary complaint of a man whose day has started, and then stop. I did not turn around. I could not have turned around. The stone was filling with light from the inside, the pale dawn color pouring up through every seam at once now, and the black between the seams had begun to thin, to go translucent, so that the slab no longer looked solid but layered deep. A thing folded around a brightness it had held shut for an age and was now, slowly, letting out. The ringing had grown until it was not a sound in the air but a pressure in the chest, in the teeth, in the long bones, the whole hall of the long weighing humming on one held note, and the dust in the bars of windowlight had begun to stand still and then to lift, drawn up off the floor by something I could not feel, hanging in the air like the hall was holding its breath. Behind me, I heard the clerks and the guards go down, not struck down the way men go down before a thing too large for them, the way you sit when your legs have stopped agreeing to hold you. I heard the scrape and stumble of it, and a guard's voice saying a name of his god over and over, low and fast, and the old overseer of the cleaners, a man named Dab who had been hard to me for 11 years out of nothing worse than the smallness of his own life. I heard him fall to his knees in the doorway and make a sound I had never heard him make, a sound that was not fear and was not joy but the thing under both of them. The sound a man makes when the world he thought he stood on turns out to have been the lid of something. And still I knelt at the foot of it, the Convict 41, the woman who had set a lump of bronze back in its row, with the light of the waking stone on my thin hands and my upturned face. And I felt the heat of it now, not warmth. The stone had never been warm, but a kind of attention with a temperature to it. A regard, vast and old and turned, for the first time in 300 years of the colony and longer than the colony by ages, turned wholly and only toward me. The court was coming. I heard the deeper bells of the colony begin under the stones one held note, the bells that called the assize to session, ringing wild and out of time because the men who rang them did not know what else to do. I heard the hall begin to fill behind me, robes and boots and the hush of many people arriving at a thing they could not believe and could not look away from. And in the middle of it, through it, the stone's seams reached their full pale fire, and the great slab parted. It did not open like a door. There were no hinges, no halves swinging wide. The black simply ceased, along the central seam, the two faces of the stone drawing back from each other the way the dark draws back from a lamp brought into a room. No motion you could point to, only that where there had been an edge there was now a width, and where there had been a slab there was now a depth, a space inside the stone full of the pale standing light, and out of that depth came the voice. I have been asked in the years since what the voice sounded like, and I have never had a good answer because it did not sound like anything. It did not come through the air. The stone's one held note was in the air, the great hum that had stood the dust up off the floor. The voice was under it, or behind it, or inside the bone of me, the way you hear your own name called in a dream and cannot say afterward whether there was a sound. It was not loud. That is the thing I can never make people believe. The whole hall heard it. 300 people heard it, and it was not loud. It was placed, set down inside each of us at once the way a true weight is set down on a true pan, with no force and no waste, exactly where it belonged. It spoke once and it spoke to me. It said, "Bearer of the even hand." I want to be careful here, because this is the part that matters, and I have heard it told wrong 100 times by people who were not there. It did not call me magistrate. It did not call me heir or queen or maker, the way the old tailies of waking relics always have it, the grand titles, the bloodlines, the lost crowns. It did not call me anything I had been or anything anyone had ever wanted to be. It named the thing I had done 3 minutes before, alone, starving, unwatched, with a lump of bronze in my fist. It named the hand that weighs and does not cheat the weighing, even against itself, even with no one to see, and it named me as the keeper of that hand, the bearer of it. And in the naming I understood all at once and without being told the whole of what the founders had gotten wrong. The light in the open depth of the stone had begun to move, to gather itself, and as it gathered it showed things, not pictures exactly but shapes of knowing, the way you understand a room in a lightning flash without having read it. I understood that the ones who had made the stone were old past the colony, past the world, a people the showing did not name and I will not pretend it did, who had built engines of judgment the way we build courts and ledgers, to settle what is owed and what is taken, who is wronged and who has wronged. And I understood the thing they had learned that we had not, the hard plain thing at the center of all of it, that a judgment is only ever as true as the hand that holds the scale, and that no amount of power makes a hand true. That power, in fact, does the opposite. That the heaviest hands, the magistrate's hands, the king's hands, the hands the founders had laid against the stone for 2 centuries certain of their worth, were exactly the hands least fit to hold a true balance, because a hand with much to gain cannot help but lean, and leans most surely when it is most sure it does not. So they had not given the engine to the powerful. They had built it to wake only for the other thing, the rare and unrewarded thing, the hand that weighs true with nothing to gain and everything to lose, the hand that holds the line when the line costs it and no one is watching and there will be no thanks. And knowing how rare that hand is among the great, they had seated it low. They had put the capacity for it not in any bloodline or crown, but in the common run of people, in the measure keepers and the cleaners and the convicts, in the ones who hold to a true number for no reward and against their own interest because the number is true. And then they had set their engines down to sleep and let the ages pass, certain that sooner or later, in some hall, in some colony, a hungry hand would close on a thing that was not its own and open again, and put the thing back, and straighten the row out of habit, with no one watching at all. The showing gave me more than that. In the long, pale moment the depth held open, and most of it I have no words for, because it was not made of words and did not pass through anything in me that words live behind. But one thing came across whole, and I have held it ever since. It was not pride in us, in our kind, the way the old waking tales pretend the relics feel, the lost guardian glad to find its bloodline again. It was nearer to relief, and nearer still to a thing I can only call respect, the respect of an old maker for the one hard part of a great work that everyone else gets wrong. The ones who built the stone had not loved the powerful and had not despised them. They had simply measured them, the way I measured a scale, and found that power and a true hand cannot share a body for long, that the one always shaves the other. And so they had done the only thing that could be done, which was to hide the true hand where power never looks, in the low places, in the gray cloth, in the people no one ways, and to trust that the line would hold there even when it held nowhere else. The stone had waited 300 years in Kale Reach, not because the worthy hand was slow to come, but because the powerful kept reaching for it first, and the powerful were never going to be it. And the engine was patient enough to outlast every one of them and wake, at last, for a woman they had thrown at its foot to humiliate her. The stone had stood at Varen's back while he lied me into gray cloth, and it had not warmed, because Varen's was the heaviest hand in the colony and the least true, and the engine knew it the way I had known the short scales of the river district, by the plain arithmetic of what a true thing weighs and what a false one only claims to. It had taken the offerings of 300 years, the seals and the petitions and the true weights of the dead assize, and given back its silence, because a heap of power is not a true hand and never was. And it had waited, with the patience the magistrates had mistaken for a virtue they could earn, for the one hand in the hall that would close on the bronze and let it go. The court had filled the hall behind me. I knew, without turning, that Holt Varen was among them, that he had come down at the wild ringing of the bells, that the first magistrate of Kale Reach was standing somewhere in that pale firelit room watching the dead stone he had used to convict me wake, for the first time in the history of the colony, and turn its whole vast regard on the convict at its foot. I knew what that meant for him before I had any idea what it meant for me. The whole order of the Reach rested on the claim that the stone agreed, that the law itself stood at the magistrate's back, that the silence was sanction. And here was the silence broken at last, and it had not broken for the magistrate. It had broken for 41, and it had called her by a name no court had ever given a woman in gray cloth, a name that was the exact opposite of the one they had hung on her. Not thief, not the one who takes the relief grain, but bearer of the even hand, the one who does not, the one who never had. I got to my feet. I do not know where the strength came from. I had not had the strength to stand quickly in months, but the stone's attention had a weight to it and a hold, and I came up under it, the way a thing rises in still water, slow and certain, and I stood before the open depth of the pale light with my thin hands at my sides and my gray coat with the number stitched on it, and I did not feel afraid. I want to be honest about that, because it is the strangest part. I had been afraid for 11 years, the low constant fear of a person with no standing, and in the moment the stone named me the fear was simply gone, not conquered, gone, the way the dark is gone from a lamplit room, and what was left in its place was not pride and not triumph. It was the thing I have spent the rest of my life trying to keep. It was the plain weight of a true thing. I had held a line. The oldest engine of judgment any of us knew of had stood up out of 3 centuries of sleep to say that the line was true. That was all, and it was everything. Behind me a voice spoke. It was Varen's. I would know it in any room, the voice that had read my sentence with his hand on the stone, and it had changed. It had the thinness in it of a man whose ground has gone. He said my number, the way he always had, 41. But it came out wrong, came out as a question where it had always been a command. And I understood that he was trying to call me back into the shape he had cut for me, to make me 41 again, the furniture, the lesson, the thing on its knees. Because as long as I was 41, the stone's waking was a mystery and not a verdict, a marvel and not a judgment on him. If I was 41, the convict, the thief of relief stores, then the stone had merely chosen strangely, the way old things do, and the order of the reach could absorb it. But if I was what the stone had named me, then the order of the reach was the false scale, and Holt Varen was the short weight in it. And every soul in that hall had just heard the oldest law any of us knew of say so without a word of accusation, only by the simple fact of whom it woke for. I turned around then. I turned and looked at him, the first magistrate in his white robe with the cross balance worked in gold, standing in the pale light of the thing he had used and could not wake. And I did not say anything clever, because I had nothing clever, and because cleverness was beneath the moment. I only looked at him with the colder eye I had been born with, the eye that had cost me 11 years, and I let him see that I was not afraid, and I let him understand that I knew, and that the stone knew, and that the 300 people in the hall would spend the rest of their lives knowing too. I had filed a true number once and it had ruined me. I did not need to file another. The stone had filed it for me, in a hand no one in Kale Reach could shave or swap or hang on a frightened clerk, and it had filed it before the whole assize, in the one court that could not be appealed. What came after I will tell quickly, because the morning was the heart of it and the rest is only the weight settling. The stone did not stay open. The pale fire held in its seams for the length of that morning and then drew slowly back down the way it had risen, the depth closing to an edge, the light to a line, the line to the cold. By the noon bells it was black again and silent again, a slab of dead glass in a tall pale room, and the colony spent 10 years arguing about whether it had ever spoken at all. But 300 people had heard it. You cannot unhear a thing set down inside your bones. The assize tried, for a season, to fold the waking into ceremony the way they folded everything, to say the stone had blessed the court by waking in the court, to leave out the small matter of whom it had named. It did not hold. Too many had heard the name, and the name did not fit a thief, and a colony that has built its whole order on a balance does not easily go on pretending after the balance has spoken. They did not free me with grand words. There were no grand words for it. The law had no shape for a sentence overturned by a stone. What happened was quieter and took the better part of a year. The granary clerk who had wept on the stand came forward, the same man, older, and told the true thing at last, and could look at me this time. And I found I had been right that I did not hate him, and that forgiving him cost me nothing because I had done it years before, at the stone's foot, in the gray mornings, out loud, to a thing I thought was not listening. The arithmetic of the river district was opened again, and this time it ran where it had always pointed, and Holt Varen was not made to kneel at the stone or clean the hall. The assize would not go that far against one of its own, and I did not ask them to. He lost his seat and his standing and his river district, and he lived out his years in his own house with his own short scales, which I am told he never had recalibrated, and that is its own kind of sentence, to grow old in a house weighed false by the hand that weighed it. They offered me a seat on the assize. I want you to know that, because it is the part that surprised me most, and because of what I did with it. The colony, having watched the oldest law any of us knew of name, a convict the bearer of the even hand, decided in its confusion that the right response was to make her a magistrate, to put the hand the stone had chosen onto the body that had chosen wrong for 300 years. They came to me with the white robe and the cross balance in gold, and they did not understand why I would not take it. I did not take it because I had finally understood the stone, and they had not. The whole lesson of the thing, the lesson the founders missed and the assize was missing all over again, was that the true hand is not the powerful one and cannot be made powerful without ceasing to be true. The moment you give the even hand a seat and a robe and a river district, you give it something to gain, and a hand with something to gain leans, and leans most surely when it is most sure it does not. The stone had not woken for a magistrate. It had woken for a measure keeper on her knees, with everything to lose and nothing to gain, and a lump of bronze she put back. If I took the robe, I would be unmaking, with my own hand, the exact thing the stone had named. So I told them no, and I asked instead for the smallest thing, the thing I had been before, my office back. I asked to be a measure keeper again. They thought it was humility, or damage, the broken sense of a woman too long in gray cloth to want anything larger. It was neither. It was the only choice that kept the hand even. I went back to the granaries and the markets with a satchel of true weights, and I checked the scales, and I made it so that when a poor family bought a measure of grain, they got a measure of grain. I did it for 30 more years. I made no allies, and I took no gifts, and I wrote down true numbers and let the fear move my arm when it would and wrote them anyway when it would not. And once in a while, when one of those numbers pointed somewhere dangerous, I thought of the bronze in my fist in the gray morning and the line I would not move, and I did not move it. There were no more wakings. The stone slept on at the back of the court, black and silent, and the magistrates went back to laying their palms on it on their investiture days and waiting to be known, and being not known, and calling the waiting a virtue. They learned nothing. People mostly do not. But I had heard it, and the 300 had heard it, and their children heard it from them. And slowly, over the long years, the way water wears a step, the colony came to weigh things a little more carefully, not because the law had grown teeth, but because the law had been heard once to take the side of the powerless against the great. And a thing like that, once heard, does not entirely fade. I am old now, and the work camp fever that nearly finished me in my 11th year left a mark on my hands that the 30 good years after never quite undid, so that on cold mornings they will not fully close. I have not knelt at the stone in a long time. The kneeling is past me. But I went back once, a few winters ago, when the hall was empty in the gray hour before the court came in, and I stood as near as my knees would let me to the foot of the great black slab, and I put my poor closing hand flat against the cold of it, in the trough where the offerings still lie, the seals and the petitions and the true weights of the dead assize, that no one has ever counted and no one ever will. The half-measure weight is still there. I found it by the worn smooth stamp, in its place in the true row, where I set it down in the gray morning of my 11th year, and where it has lain even and ordered ever since, 3 strides from the high seat, in the one court that cannot be appealed. I did not take it. I straightened the line of it with the edge of my thumb, out of 50 years of habit and a lifetime before that, and I left it where it lay. The stone was cold and black and silent, the way it has been since the morning, and it did not wake for me, and I did not want it to. It had named me once in front of everyone in a hand no one could shave. A true thing does not need to be said twice. It said it. I heard it. I have spent the rest of my life trying to be worth the saying, which is the only thing the name ever asked of me, and the hardest, and I am not done. And I will not be done when they finally come for the gray-haired woman in the small house who still keeps a satchel of true weights by the door, though her hands can barely lift them now. They will give me a number again at the end, I expect, the way they do on a stone or in a ledger. Let them. I answered to a number once and believed it was the truer name, and I was wrong, and a thing that has stood since before the world told me so out loud in a room full of the men who gave it to me. I know my name. It is not 41, and it was never thief. It is the thing I did with a lump of bronze in an empty hall when no one was watching, and there was nothing to gain and everything to lose, and put it back, and straightened the row. Bearer of the even hand, I have tried to carry it level. That is the whole of what I have to tell.